mean, one of my points, there's an article I wrote called Founding versus Inheriting. One really good way of thinking about the current US government and the US establishment, really, because more than just the US government, the reason that it doesn't understand, it can't execute, partly because it hasn't had competition, but partly because it's essentially inherited a monopoly from better men. If you think about the difference, think about a founder who sets up a factory, okay? They pass it down to their heir who passes it down, and it's just cranking out widgets and churning out money, and it's a great grandson or whatever of the founders inherited the factory, okay? One day, and so it seems like the thing is working. It's, DuPont brand widgets or something like that, right? And the great grandson has the famous name, and he's got the money, and everybody looks at him legally as a legitimate heir of that founder because, hey, look at, here's all the documents, the chain of custody or whatever, right? Then one fine day, that factory has to switch from making widgets to making masks or like servers or something new. It has to do something new. This great grandson does not have the skill of the founder. They cannot change the assembly line. They don't know what they're doing. Neither do the career managers who have been hired over the time. Like the ability to do something from scratch, to do something new, that was the domain of the founder. So all these people are just running systems that men better than themselves set up years and years ago, right? They're not the founders, they're the heirs. And so we understand this within the context of a factory, that the like great great grandson of Rockefeller or DuPont or whatever is not Rockefeller or DuPont. I mean, in one sense, like, half your genes go to your child and then half again and half more generations you go down. It's not like the same person anymore. It's like one half to the nth power n generations down, right? So not the same person, but they're legitimate. They're just not competent. They were selected for legitimacy, but not competence, right? And so what you want to do now, conversely, if you select for quote competence, but not legitimacy, that's like someone taking over the factory, blam, 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 hostile takeover, or not even hostile takeover. That's at least a legal thing. Like seizing the factory. Maybe they're actually good at operating it, but they're considered illegitimate. The society's like, you just stole it from them, blah, blah. Okay. That's like, for example, nationalization of oil fields and stuff like that, with various independence movements, this kind of thing. So you want is both legitimate and competent, and simply just identifying that as an axis, right? Legitimate and competent. Well, that's why you need to have refoundings, because nobody would have elected Elon to run Tesla or elected Mark Zuckerberg to go and run, at 30 something years old, to run a 3.6 billion communications network. He could only have proved it by doing it, by founding it, right, from scratch. So the from scratch aspect is so ridiculously important. And that relates to all of our current institutions because they're decades, in some cases, hundreds of years old, and they're just built for a different time and by better men. The people today, like George Washington organized like the armies of the United States from scratch, right? The NYPD was at one point organized from scratch, right? Even FDA or whatever was organized from scratch at one point, right? These organizations are now so many generations down that they're just inherited by heirs, okay? And sometimes they're literal heirs in the sense, and I talk about this in the book, in the founding versus inheriting chapter, I just pasted in here. But sometimes they're literal heirs in the sense of like a DuPont or a Rockefeller or, like Sulzberger, who's inherited the New York Times from his father's 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 father, right? Like it's like 5 generations. And by the way, just on that, I do talk about that in the book. It's like, there's this great website that you should check out. It's called Tech Journalism is Less Diverse Than Tech.com. And the point being that actually the journos who endlessly talk about tech diversity and so it's far less diverse than tech itself, right? A lot of these tech journalists are basically employees of some East Coast nepotist who's inherited millions of dollars and or a newspaper and is funding their whole operation. So they're meritless nepotists and or employees thereof who are attacking the self-made, right? And once you see that, you're like, oh, these journalists are basically like dogs on a leash. They're hitmen for old money, right? Assassins for the establishment. They have no legitimacy whatsoever. It's literally old money attacking new money. The meritless attacking the the meritocracy or the more meritocratic as privileged. It's like the privileged attack, it's like actually this amazing inversion when you apply that lens to it. The thing is, this entire establishment has, it's declining legitimacy, but it has legitimacy, it doesn't have competence. And so it can't innovate because it's not selected for founders. Like if you were a founder, would you go to the US government or the US establishment? No, that the whole point is you can't found anything. You can, like, your career ambition is to try to paste some language into an 1,100-page bill the night before it gets approved in a vote where nobody reads it, right? Like, and it's deployed to the entire country. It's, imagine if like that's how like Google was coded. Some giant political meeting, blah blah, and someone like pastes in some JavaScript. Obviously, that could be malware. Obviously, it could be self-interested. Obviously, that's not like the way to test something, to roll it out, to deploy it. Like, future historians will look at our current time and these institutions as so insane in many ways. Like, just one example is the thing I just mentioned, where you're deploying code to 300 million people that you haven't read, you haven't tested in the sandbox, you haven't got any, room for iteration. The people who are responsible for writing it aren't responsible for implementing it. It's like totally broken on that level. On another level, you're voting for somebody and the contract isn't binding. They give some campaign promise. They say they're going to do something. They're not going to do it. It's literally like buying something that's labeled milk and getting orange juice. That's fraud in the commercial, in the commercial setting. That's fraud, right? So electoral fraud is when, I mean, the most routinized version of it is when a politician says they're going to do X, gets your vote on that basis, and does Y. Then people say, "Oh, that's representative democracy." There, I'm like, well, your vote literally didn't count, and your vote doesn't count. There's literally you have no recourse. They've got like, where it's, some form of immunity, right? You cannot sue them for not voting your way, right? So it's all completely symbolic. And the alternatives, I mean, those are just like two examples, like ridiculous examples of how bad the current system is. And so you cannot fix that system. You have to figure out a way to get outside it. Why do you want to get outside it? Well, I mentioned the FDA as a huge motivation, but there's lots of others. You want self-driving? You're going to need sovereignty. Do you want drone delivery? You're going to need some form of sovereignty. Do you want, like, to be able to have nuclear power? You're probably going to need some form of sovereignty. Like, Wyoming is pushing some of this. There's good things happening in some places. They're like accelerating it. You want to innovate in the physical world? You're going to need some form of sovereignty. One of the big recipes of the network state is not just to say, Thiel's correct observation, you can innovate in bits, you can't innovate in atoms. You can build $1 billion business online, you need 1 billion permits to build a shed in San Francisco. That is true. We reconcile that tension by using bits to innovate in atoms, by building this aligned community online. And the alignment is ridiculously important. They need to do the dance, right? They need to coordinate and choreograph together. They need to be able to, if they can't all hit like on something, they literally can't do anything else. But if they can do that, then they might be able to do a lot of other things. You've turned them into a multicellular organism, right? The content is also really important. It's not just the code, it's the community and the content as well as the code, right? So all the messaging they're putting out, the Declaration of Independence, it actually had that thing at the beginning which says, with an eye towards the opinion of all men, right? Actually, here was the Declaration preamble. I just want to get that right. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, blah, blah. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Okay.